Thank you, everyone. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge I'll be presenting some work. Some of it's mine, but a lot of it is by other people, and it's really a collaborative effort. And since I only was asked to do this talk at the end of very recently, I haven't got all the names on the presentation, but I just want to acknowledge some of them, some colleagues from the University of New South Wales, Tom LeBreton and Mark Uy, and Berra McKenzie from the New South Wales Environment Department. They've been instrumental in some of the ideas I'm going to tell you about and a lot of the work that's been done. But there are many other people as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. What are megafires? Essentially really big fires which cover a lot of the landscape that occur in a particular fire season. We're seeing them now across the globe. So what we're seeing in Australia, what we saw in Australia in 2019-20, is now described as a megafire, is kind of part of the cycle that's going on with global warming around the world. How do those sort of things affect plants is what we're interested in. So fire regimes and fire has been in the Australian continent for millions of years. So it's sort of nothing new. The continent has changed its climate, it's drifted north, got warmer and drier. We had the indigenous nations arrive about 65,000 years ago, and they used fire as a tool to manage that landscape. Because the Europeans arrived and things changed quite dramatically after that, we've cleared a lot of the land, we've fragmented it, we've changed how we use fire. We mainly use fire now for protection of life and property, especially in the East Coast and the Southwest. We've also changed a whole lot of ignition sources. We have a lot more people in this country. Ollie had a little example the other day about stealing fire and people taking fire from the people who know how to use it. Everybody in Australia's got a box of matches and a lighter. So everybody now has fire and has the ability to use it. And arsonists, we might say, or innocent users, cause a lot of fires that we didn't have in the past. We've also got, and we're facing with rapid global warming, which is influencing the likelihood of fire occurrence in the landscape. So in 2019-20, we had a major set of fires across southeastern and southwestern Australia. So on the left, you can see a map. The red shows you where the fires occurred from southeast Queensland right down through eastern New South Wales, eastern Victoria, Kangaroo Island, it's harder to see in South Australia, and in parts of southwestern WA. This is probably the most extensive set of fires in one season we'd had in the southern part of the country on record. So that gives you some context to where they were. So there were a number of plant conservation efforts after those fires. The Commonwealth Government, to its credit, initiated a group of people who looked at what are we going to do? What are our priorities? We only have limited resources. What should we look at? So people worked on plants, people worked on vertebrates, invertebrates, and ecosystems. A whole lot of scientists and other managers. If you want to really know about the detail of that work, there are a number of reports, but also there's this book on the right, Australian Megafires, which came out, I think about a year or so ago now, which gives a good summary of all the things they did and some of the lessons that have been learnt from that particular experience. Today I'm just going to talk about plants and the occasional mention of an ecosystem. So just focus on what happened with the plants to give you some background to sort of the thinking that went into what was at risk based on those fires that occurred in 2019-20. So for plants, the first question we asked was, well, what things, plant species and ecosystems dominated by plants are going to be most impacted? What should we spend our management dollars on? The limited dollars that we have for plants, especially compared to other things such as all the animals. So a number of us got together and said, well, how do we kind of develop a framework or a tool to help us think about what the priorities might be? And that's that thing on the right, this framework for identifying priorities. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the detail in that, but it was developed and it was then used by Rachel Gallagher, who did an absolutely amazing piece of work within just a few months to go through, I think she said she did 26,000 Australian plants. Now, obviously, not all of those are in the fire footprint, but the amount of work she did in a short period of time was just simply incredible. And from that work, using that prioritisation framework to look at what we think should be most at risk, okay, this is just what we think rather than what is in reality, she identified around about 500 plant species that we really need to get out there and have a look what was going on, do some post-fire surveys, and then think about how to manage the threats they're facing after the fires, and also what recovery actions are needed for them. So the bottom line is, from this one set of fires, we think there's 500. Other work around the country by other people has got that number up to closer to 700. That's a lot of things to look at in a short period of time. And I'll give you a little example about how much inroads we've made into looking at some of those things, which is just a small amount. We're lucky there was some funding available from the Commonwealth Government and New South Wales Government and some of the other state governments. Much of that funding went into post-fire survey efforts, which are really critical for this. So we had some ideas from the framework about what should be impacted, and I'll explain how we derived those shortly. But when we got our priorities, we really need to look at what had actually happened in the field. And that takes manpower, and there's been so many people doing such great work looking at and going out and doing surveys after the fires. The last sort of thing we did was to look at the conservation status, do IUCN Red List assessments, and it's kind of in a way a test of how well our framework worked. So were the things we thought were a priority, did they turn out to be important to look at? So that's the kind of the check of how well that went or not. And I'll just take you through some of those steps today. I don't know how much you all know about fire and fire regimes. It's a whole nother talk in itself. Here's the slide which kind of tries to summarise it. Don't try and take it all in one go. It's integrated, interactive and complicated. On the right-hand side, it's just a few points. So that the framework we used really looked at what are the key things that would drive decline in species. So mechanisms of decline. How sensitive are those species to those mechanisms? And how much of their distribution was exposed to those fires during that megafire event. So it sort of combined those three things. If you want to know about how fire regimes cause biodiversity decline, if you look on the left-hand side, the Commonwealth Threatened Species Scientific Committee has produced a key threatening process document to explain that, and that's a really good place to go and look and start to see why certain things, certain changes to fire regimes can cause declines in species, both for animals and for plants. And in the middle is kind of some of the elements that we use to derive this. And I'm not really going to go into any detail in this except to say that the framework we had essentially used the blue column there and some of the elements in that. And you might be able to see them on the back. They say things like high fire frequency impacts, low fire frequency, high severity impacts, effective herbivores, predators, competitors, pathogens and drought, things like that. So we have components of the fire regime and things associated with it, and we have biotic and abiotic factors that can all influence persistence of species and ecosystems. But that middle diagram's in that KTP anyway, so you can look at it in detail within that document. So in essence, what we did was say, well, we had these megafires at the top. We'd worked out on those things on the boxes on the right with arrows going to the second box. We wanted to look at the sensitivity of species. We wanted to look at fire regime impacts and both biotic and abiotic factors to develop some criteria to assess likelihood of decline. That's what the framework is. Rachel identified species priorities for plants. David Keith identified ecosystem priorities. So that's just two of the groups that are really plant-dominated work. And the aim was then to think about management and recovery for these. Obviously, post-fire survey is a key component of that, and there are a number of things that are quite immediate and urgent, and other things that may be mid-term or long-term in terms of management. Now, my talk's really about megafires and what we're going to do, what happened with the last one, and perhaps what are we going to do with the next one, which is coming. And so some of those things at the bottom are useful, but we'll come back a little bit to them towards the end. So from the framework and looking at what we thought was most at risk in terms of decline for biodiversity, these are the kind of half a dozen things that came out affecting most species. So fire frequency was probably the main component. And remember, the megafires are one fire in the landscape. And I'm talking about fire frequency, which is how many times that megafire burnt over areas where the areas had already been burnt previously, but the plants hadn't recovered from that previous fire. So that's the key for that. Fire severity, it's a fancy word. The simplest way to kind of deal with it is think high severity fire means the treetops are burnt. And so when you look up after the fire, they're all dead, and sometimes there's only trunks left and they're shooting from the base of the trunk, or whole trees are killed. In lower severity fire, the tree trunks, the tops of the trees are still green, or they're just scorched. So you have that sort of the high severity fires, and there was a lot of extent of high severity fire in the megafires, burning the tops of trees. Drought played a big role in terms of us having these fires, because the preceding years were very, a lot of drought, very dry, but also there were impacts of weeds, pathogens, and herbivores. They were the main drivers of the concern we had for risk for certain species. I'll start with just a couple of examples of these. So here's fire frequency. This is some work from Tom LeBreton and his PhD. So this is just a subset of the distribution of the megafires in Eastern Australia. And the grey area there represents where the fires occurred. And if you look at just the orange areas, they're areas that Tom suggested were burnt. The 2019-20 fires burnt over areas that hadn't recovered from previous fires. So we would expect species declines in all those orange areas. And there's an awful lot of orange across that map. So this is something that was a main driver for what we predicted to be changed. The yellow are areas where it's the first time it burnt over areas or had a frequent fire, short fire interval between fires occurring. The orange ones, it had happened before, so it was just a history of having short interval fires, of which the megafires contributed to. Why is that a problem? There's some detail there, but the short story is that for those plant species, and a number are killed by fire, like this Banksia subspecies at the bottom. You have a plant on the bottom left, you burn it and you just find the dead stick out there, and you hope to find seedlings on the right. But if you actually look at the plant on the bottom left, there's no fruits on it. It's only covered in flowers. So if you burn those sort of plants on the left, you don't actually get any seedlings. So if you burn too frequently in these sort of species, you can eliminate them entirely because their seed bank may be exhausted by one single fire. Other species have more resilience because they have soil seed banks, but that's the simple idea. The other major group that can be affected are some of the ones that we think are able to resprout after fire. They have various mechanisms to do that, but they have to recruit as well. And so you need periods between fire to allow those recruits, those young seedlings, to grow up and grow a lignotuber, grow a dormant tuber, or whatever it is that they need to survive the next fire. You need that interval between fires to allow that to happen. And that's particularly important if you get a lot of adult mortality in a particular fire, as we see happened in these megafires. The other component that was, I'm just going to touch on a couple, was quite important, was fire severity. Most of the media you would have heard about the fires was about they were catastrophic. There's an enormous amount of animals that died, and that's a really sad thing. There's an enormous amount of plants that died because they're killed by fire as well. I'm going to start with the other side of the coin, those things that may have actually liked it. There are some plants that do enjoy this sort of thing. And so these ones we don't think are as much at risk because fire severity isn't such an issue for them. In fact, they probably like it. And some of them are the ones that really have their germination controlled by soil heating. So you need to heat the soil enough to get them to germinate and respond. All the adults in these cases, the examples below, they're all killed by fire. So there's nothing left alive after the fire. And it's totally reliant on those seedlings coming up to replace the populations. And One of my favourite plants, Grevillea kalei, it's a critically endangered plant around northern Sydney. There's a bit of work we've done to look at that. And on the bottom right, you'll see sort of population size. If you burn it at high severity, you get everything's killed in all these sites when you burn it. You get really good recruitment at a couple of sites. If you burn it at low severity, you either get very poor recruitment, or at site 3 you get nothing. Now there's still a seed bank there. It's not extinct at that site, but that seed bank's not replenished between fires, so it's just going to decline. And if you keep doing this, you'll end up with population decline in this species and species like it. So that's the kind of the ones that are tolerant to fire severity. But of course, there are lots that aren't. So on the bottom right, you'll see, tree canopies basically burnt and some resprouting from either below ground or from lower trunks. So there's a lot of that happened after the megafires. On the bottom left, you'll see really long-lived plants like this Xanthorrhea. They're just burnt out and killed by the fire. So what we saw after the 2019-20 fires was sometimes there's so much heating that some of the plants we would expect to normally resprout had high levels of mortality, so they weren't very good at resprouting and recovering. As you increase fire severity, you increase the heat load on plants and you kill more of them. The Wallamai pines are a good example of that. In this case, the fire's getting in and causing tissue death at the base of the trees that can undermine whole trunks, and the trunk then rots and gets killed over the next few years. There are other impacts as well. I mentioned those top few things. Drought, pre-fire drought was really important. Interaction between the fires and pre-fire drought, particularly fire severity, led to increased mortality of plants that would normally resprout and recover pretty well after any one fire. And there's some very good examples in the literature now about that. And we've heard this morning about fire and disease interactions, so I'm not really going to talk about that. I'll just keep going. So now I want to talk about the role a little bit on the side, what AMPC did with all this. So AMPC became involved in this process, and it's really an interesting story in its own right. Getting money for post-fire surveys, assessments, thinking about what recovery is needed is hard to do in this country. And so we were very lucky because the megafires, lucky, that's a funny word. The megafires were a global issue, and so many people around the world saw what happened in Australia and wanted to contribute something. And so we were lucky that in the United States, the Centre for Plant Conservation, in collaboration with San Diego Zoo, had some money donated by the public for plant conservation. And so that came to AMPC here, and so we've had a zoo in the United States giving us money to look at conservation of plants. It's just a wonderful story, but how lucky are we? And so we've done a couple of things with this money, and we're still in the process of doing these things. The first one, led by Jeremy Brule and Heidi Zimmer, is really looking at epiphytic orchids. This is a group of plants that we've kind of neglected, in a sense, in terms of their impact of fire and these megafires in particular. They don't have a seed bank. They have to kind of come back into the system, and they hope that the whole population doesn't get killed to survive. And so we're looking at a number of these species now to do survey work and then to look at their conservation status. We're also doing a number of other species there, again looking at survey work and assessing their conservation status and seeing what recovery actions are needed. So ANPC is directly involved in doing this work. Coming back to where I was before, did the framework work in terms of predictions? Were things that we thought were at risk actually at risk? So this is a result of some work led by University of New South Wales for 135 of Rachel Gallagher's 500 or so priorities, and funded by the Commonwealth Government Species Expert Assessment Plan funding. The take-home message is that of those 135, most are in critically endangered and endangered, a few are vulnerable. A very few are in the middle bar, which came out as not threatened. So the predictions were these things are at risk and we really need to do something about them, they're going to decline, When we looked at the data, post-fire and other data, that was confirmed, largely confirmed. The problem we have is that we only looked at 135 of those 500, 600. So all the rest are probably going to look like this as well. So there's a lot of plant species out there that we still got to pay some attention to, analyse the data, and do some conservation management for. My last slide is just, what are you going to do next? Because it's coming again. Let's not think it was a one-off event. It's not. I'm not going to give you any answers, but it's something we need to think about. I'd love to see an Australian fire response database, a way we can record the data that people have collected across the nation in a unified way. There is tools developing now that help that. That's great. I'd like to see increased collaboration with Indigenous culture and knowledge to help the process. That's beginning. We've seen a lot of talks about that at this conference. I'd like to see some mechanisms where we protect sensitive ecosystems and species from too frequent fire or even fire at all in some places. Rainforests, the Wallamai pine. Wallamai pine is lucky, it has a recovery team. We've heard recovery teams talked about here. An active recovery team, a brand new recovery plan about to come out from the Commonwealth. One of the rare ones, but those mechanisms allowed it to be proactive in terms of protecting that species in the megafires, and there's already a plan for the next fire for that species. So I'll leave that open there and I'll finish up on that, but just to keep you thinking about what are we going to do next.